All right, guys. Well, welcome to another episode of Backroom Talk. I'm Georgia here with Carl, and we're going to start the conversation for today with a little bit of conversation around something you guys may or may not have heard about the topic of whether CrossFit can be individualized or not. And where does this come from, Carl?
Yeah, I think people that pay attention in that world and in our world, which are two separate worlds. They may have seen James was on the Savon podcast, which very entertaining podcast. I kind of dug into that after James was on there. He was on there, and the question was asked was I forgot the exact framing, but the idea of individualization came up, and what is individualization? And the question was asked to James, I believe, do you think CrossFit is individualized? And James very quickly said no, which wasn't a bash, right? It wasn't a dig at CrossFit. He just said it wasn't individualized. And there was quite a bit of fallout from that, surprisingly. If you guys are listening to this podcast, you guys know what we do. You know our beliefs. You know that everything that we do is based around the individual. So to us, it's like there's not a lot of other fitness education companies that are saying the things that we're saying and basing an entire methodology around the individual, a single person. In our opinion, CrossFit doesn't do that. I might be, missing something. I haven't been in that world in quite some time, so forgive me if some things have changed there. But based on what I know CrossFit to be, it's definitely not individualized. I own multiple CrossFit facilities. The reason why I went away from that stuff is because I couldn't individualize it no matter how hard I tried. That's kind of where the conversation started.
Yeah, I think it's confusing, or where the confusion kind of arises from. And I guess, like, first of all, the reason this blew up is because Dave Castro took a clip of James answering that question and made a nice long caption about how he does believe that CrossFit is individualized. And that's where this thing really gained momentum, and a lot of people were talking back and forth on it. But I do think it just comes down to, like, fundamentally, we have different definitions of what individualization means. And so when you've got two groups or two people that are shouting at each other, I'm not saying James was shouting or even that Dave Castro was
No, not
shouting,
at
but
all. No.
and it was a really measured conversation. The conversation James had with Savan, I think it was great and very respectful. But James,
Who was the other guy on the podcast? Was it Brian?
he's a CCP coach,
Yes.
right?
Is it Brian?
I'm not sure.
Oh man, just keep going. I want to look that
Yeah.
up because I do want to get his name right.
Yeah, but I think where the conflict is that Dave Castro and James Fitzgerald just have different conceptions of what individualized really means. And for Dave, he was talking about how he has seen CrossFit be individualized in CrossFit gyms. To us, that's scaling. It's not individual design, right?
Mm-hmm.
Individual design is onboarding a client, putting them through assessment and intake, having a one-to-one conversation with them, and designing a training program that is purely based on their capabilities and where they want to go and what their goals are. That is different to taking a group workout and changing what is inside of it to try and preserve the stimulus but make it more appropriate for that person. There's nothing wrong with doing that, and
Mm-hmm.
it's probably it's a smarter way to train than just slapping a program on 30 people and saying go. I've done that, right? I've been that person at the front of the room changing up the workout for a group of people, but it isn't individualization in the way that we as OPEX would define individualization.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I think about what individualization is, it's exactly what you just said. But you have to have context of the individual. One thing that we don't have when we have 20 people in front of us is absolute context for every single one of those humans in front of you. So if I'm standing in front of a room and I have 20 people in front of me and I realize person 6 can't do this overhead squat deal that I have programmed, I'm scaling that or I'm changing that right there on the fly, right? That's scaling or changing. That's not individualizing, right? Individualizing is having context of, that person's training history, their injury history, their capabilities and movement, their goals. I can go on and on and on, right? There might be some CrossFit coaches in front of a group class that do have that context for every single person in their facility. I have yet to see it, But hey, that might be the truth for some gym owners or CrossFit coaches out there. But that's not what the model is,
Yeah.
right? So that's where it's like, yeah, it was a very simple. It's very simple. If someone came up to me and they said, "Is CrossFit individualized?" I wouldn't like bash it and say, "Oh, absolutely not. That shit's stupid." I would never say that. But I would say, "No, it's absolutely not individualized. It is group training." You have a group in front of you, and that group is all doing the same thing. Are there gyms that have groups doing different things? Maybe, I have no idea, right? But from what I know to be CrossFit, that's not it, right? Um, is there personal training happening in CrossFit gyms? Yes, absolutely, right? Like that happens. CrossFit was actually built on personal training. I don't know if people remember that, but I remember Glassman putting out, this is how you should onboard. This is how this whole thing works. And this was like in 2004, 2003, 2004. That's not what's happening though, right? That's not what's happening. So when I think about a CrossFit methodology, I think about what's happening in CrossFit affiliates around the world. And in CrossFit affiliates around the world, what is happening is group training, right? They might be doing some PT on the side or some individual design actually on the side. And we have a fair amount of coaches that come through our program that are CrossFit coaches. And they're like, hey, no, I'm doing this group thing, but I also want to spin up this individual design thing, right? I want to have 15, 20, 30 individual design clients. And they're doing both, right? But they're not coming to us and saying the people that we're doing individual design with are doing CrossFit. It's like they understand that those are two different things, right? And yeah, we saw a bunch of people bashing James for saying those things, and I hope those people would just listen to the rest of the podcast because I thought it was an awesome conversation, and I thought Savan asked some really good questions, and I still have to find his name. I think it's Brian, but I think he had some really good context as well because he fell in that group, right? Like, I'm a CrossFit coach. I got into CCP, and it just kind of changed the way I thought about things. It didn't make me hate CrossFit. I just started doing some things differently. I don't think he totally nixed his, association with CrossFit at that point, but it just made him open his eyes to different ways of doing things, and that way was individualization, and that was obviously different than what he was taught at CrossFit Level 1.
Yeah, I think to have a productive conversation and not just, again, be like two groups like yelling at one another, we have to agree what individualization does or doesn't mean. And it's okay to have different conceptions of that. We just have to call them two different things, right? And realize that we're talking about slightly different ideas. We also have to define what it means to do CrossFit. Because in Dave Castro's post, he did point out that a lot of CrossFit Games athletes, they are doing individualized training. But I would say those guys are doing individual design.
Yeah, definitely.
Like they're not doing the group class WOD. Like maybe they jump in on the workout of the day with their gym every so often. But those guys are following very structured, individualized training programs that are designed for them by an ID coach, oftentimes an OPEX educated coach.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth acknowledging that we don't have a clear definition of what it means to do CrossFit. And we have to decide on what that is too.
Yeah, and we have to understand, what is what is doing CrossFit? What is doing OPEX? We very clearly laid out what is doing OPEX means, right? You use the OPEX methodology. You assess, you design, you consult, and you continue to do those things with an individual. One coach coaches another client. It's one-to-one, right? We don't really know, and hey, I'm open to being wrong. I am. So I may just be wrong on what CrossFit is, but CrossFit to me, it's varied, it's intense, it's quote unquote random. It's being ready for everything. And it gets murky when we start to say, well, this competitive CrossFitter, right? Competitive CrossFit Games athlete does CrossFit. And it's like, well, do they? Right? Like what you just laid out. It's like, do they do varied fitness? Yeah, actually, right? In a pre-competition phase, right? Are they doing varied fitness, when they're in their structural build? No, they're in a structural build, right? Like there's probably some progression in mind there. So it just gets weird, right? It's like, because the test looks like this, that means that, the outcome because the outcome is the same for everyone, the path to that outcome has to be the same for everyone, and that's just not the case. It's not the case. We know a lot of CrossFit Games athletes that do not take a varied approach to get to that outcome. They take a very structured approach to get really good at the things that they're not good at, right? You get someone that can do 36 unbroken muscle ups. That person isn't working on a shit ton of muscle ups in their structural build phase, right? But that person can only do, 15 unbroken kipping handstand push-ups. That person's probably doing a lot of handstand push-up builds, right? Or like vertical pushing stability builds and stuff like that to be able to shore up those weaknesses. So that's individualized, right? Like what I just walked through. So I just don't know a bunch of gyms that are doing that, and gyms shouldn't do that. CrossFit gyms shouldn't do that. They shouldn't treat all of their members like they're CrossFit Games athletes, because they're not. And I think CrossFit would agree with that, kind of. I believe. I could be wrong on that, but it's just different, right? It's different. Individualization and, constantly varied, high intensities, those things are completely different in our opinion. And we put our, flag in the ground, and we're like, we actually don't want to do intense fitness. So we disagree with CrossFit on that, of course, and that's okay. I mean, that's a good opportunity for a good conversation, right? It'd be awesome to have, James and, someone from CrossFit to have a conversation, right? Kind of like Savan and James had a conversation on why we don't believe in intense fitness, and CrossFit can say, this is why we believe in intense fitness. And, it doesn't have to be like a jab, jab, jab. It could just be a conversation. So I'm going way off the deep end on this, but I think that would be beneficial.
I do. So long as we take the time on the front end to establish where we're talking from and what we mean by CrossFit, what we mean by OPEX, and what we mean by individualization or scaling or group.
Yep.
You lay those definitions, then you have the opportunity to have a productive conversation.